When the old yellow school bus rolled out of Denver, it didn't look like a home. It looked like a ghost on four wheels. But for Samuel Hayes and his loyal dog Max, it was their fortress. A veteran fleeing the shadows of war, Samuel wasn't seeking comfort. He was chasing silence. He believed that if he could lock the world out, he could also lock his nightmares in. Yet on that very first night in the Wyoming wilderness, he discovered a terrifying truth. The silence he craved wasn't a cure. It was a mirror, reflecting all the ghosts he had tried to bury. The night air over Denver was heavy with the scent of asphalt and rain, a restless wind pushing clouds across the glowing skyline. Inside that endless hum of cars, neon, and voices. Samuel Hayes drove slowly, gripping the cracked steering wheel of a battered yellow school bus that rattled with every bump on the uneven road. To a passing eye, it was junk, flaking paint, scarred panels, windows filmed with dust. But to Samuel it was more than a vehicle. It was the last gamble of a man desperate to escape the noise of his own mind. Samuel Hayes was 42 years old, tall, lean from years of military service, but weathered in a way that made him appear older. His dark hair was flecked with silver, cut close on the sides but left ragged on top, as though he had forgotten the last time he cared about appearances. His jaw was strong, stubborn, and covered in the rough shadow of a beard that he never shaved completely, giving him the look of a man caught between discipline and neglect. The faint lines around his gray-green eyes spoke of both exhaustion and vigilance. Those were the eyes of someone who never truly slept, who listened for footsteps, even in silence. Samuel had served 2 long tours in Iraq, where his unit patrolled streets choked with dust and danger. He had survived ambushes, watched comrades fall, and carried the weight of explosions that burned images into his brain. The war had taken his hearing in the right ear and left behind a constant ringing, a whisper of chaos that followed him into civilian life. He worked briefly as a mechanic after returning home, but every noise of the garage reminded him of engines revving before an attack, of steel doors slamming shut, of metal screaming under stress. He quit, drifted from job to job, and sank further into himself. The Veterans Affairs doctors called it PTSD. He called it ghosts. Tonight he drove with only one passenger, Max. The German Shepherd was 6 years old, a powerful, sable-coated dog with amber eyes that glowed with intelligence. His ears twitched at every sound, and his muscular frame leaned steady against the torn seat, as if he understood his role was not merely companion, but sentry. Samuel had adopted Max from a rescue shelter 2 years ago. The dog had been abandoned by a handler who left for another state. And in the animal's steady gaze, Samuel had seen a reflection of his own solitude. Max had a deep chest and long legs, his coat a blend of gray and tan with a darker mask across his face. Unlike other dogs that barked for attention, Max was quiet, watchful, responding to Samuel's voice with an obedient tilt of his head. That silence was comforting, but it also reminded Samuel of patrols in foreign streets, when silence meant the danger was listening. As the bus rolled through Denver's outskirts, streetlights flickering across its dented sides, Samuel's mind replayed fragments he could not suppress. The flash of sandstorms, the metallic taste of blood, the radio. Static before a mortar round fell. He had bought the school bus from a scrapyard with nearly all his savings. The man who sold it to him, a broad-shouldered fellow with oil-stained hands named Pete, had laughed at the idea of turning it into a home. "She won't get far without breaking down," Pete had warned, wiping his grease-covered beard, "and she drinks fuel like a dying horse." Samuel had merely nodded, unconcerned. He did not buy the bus for efficiency. He bought it because it was thick steel, because it had once carried children and survived decades of road wear, because he could shut its doors and be alone. Tonight was the first night he would test his theory. He guided the bus onto a cracked lot at the edge of the city, weeds pushing through the concrete, old billboards looming like forgotten guardians. Rain began to fall in uneven sheets, pattering against the roof. Samuel parked, turned off the engine, and sat still, hands clenched tight. The silence that followed was suffocating. He thought he wanted it. He had prayed for silence for years, but now it roared in his head like a void. Max shifted beside him, exhaled, then settled his chin on his paws, his tail curled neatly. The dog's calmness only emphasized Samuel's unease. He had lived among people too long, absorbing their chatter, their laughter, their city clamor. Here, there was nothing but the sound of his heartbeat and the ghostly echoes of war. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness he saw a street in Fallujah, the sun baking the dust white, a Humvee burning at the end of the block. He remembered pulling Corporal Stevens from the wreckage, the young man's arm mangled, blood soaking his uniform. Stevens's voice had been high, trembling. "Don't leave me." Samuel never did, but Stevens still died hours later. That voice still echoed in Samuel's dreams. The steel bus walls felt too thin, too porous to hold back such memories. He turned on the small camping stove he had installed, boiled water in a tin cup, and sipped the bitter coffee that scalded his tongue, but grounded him. His eyes flicked to Max, who now lifted his head, ears pricked, as though he too sensed the shift in the air. Samuel whispered, "Easy, boy," his voice rough, almost breaking. He envied the dog's certainty, the unwavering loyalty written into muscle and bone. Samuel had been betrayed by memory, by government promises, by comrades who returned to their lives while he remained adrift. Max never betrayed. Yet even with Max's presence, the silence of the lot grew unbearable. He heard the city in the distance, muffled horns, the cry of a siren, and it felt like a taunt. Civilization carrying on without him, while he hid in an abandoned corner. He wondered if he had made a mistake. Could a bus, no matter how solid, ever shield him from his mind? He ran his fingers over the worn dashboard, traced the grooves left by years of schoolchildren carving initials. Once this bus had carried laughter and chatter. Now it carried only a broken soldier and his shadow. Midnight crept closer. Samuel stretched out on the narrow cot he had bolted to the floor, his boots still on, his jacket zipped high against the cold. He listened to the rain soften, listened to Max breathing slow and even, and told himself to rest. But every time he closed his eyes, the silence revealed another face, another explosion, another voice calling for help. He realized then the truth he had feared. Silence was not a cure. It was a mirror, merciless and unbroken, reflecting all the ghosts he had tried to bury. The bus had wheels, it had the promise of escape, but wherever he drove, the ghosts would climb aboard with him. As sleep finally dragged him under, Samuel knew the road ahead would not just be miles of landscape. It would be a battlefield, fought in his own mind, with Max as his only ally. The highway west unfurled like a ribbon of cracked asphalt across the plains, its edges frayed with weeds and drifting dust. Samuel Hayes kept the old yellow school bus steady at 50 miles per hour, the engine coughing and rattling in protest with each rise of the road. Max, the German shepherd, sat upright in the passenger seat, his body tense but calm, amber eyes watching the shifting horizon as if reading the land. To Samuel, the silence between man and dog felt like the closest thing to conversation he could endure. 3 days had passed since he left Denver. The city lights had faded into memory, replaced by open stretches of land where wind rolled unbroken and sky pressed down in a vast, unyielding dome. He had talked to Max in the rhythm of the drive, telling fragments of stories he could never share with people, names of comrades who never returned, jokes that turned bitter in his mouth, plans that had dissolved in sandstorms. Max never judged. He simply tilted his head when Samuel's voice faltered. a steady heartbeat in the hollow of the bus. Each night they parked along the edges of forgotten highways. Samuel would step outside, boots sinking into dust or gravel, and stare at the stars that flared sharp above the emptiness. The bus, once filled with the laughter of children, now carried only him and his dog. He cooked simple meals on a camp stove, beans, rice, black coffee, and slept lightly, waking at the smallest rustle of wind. Sleep did not bring peace. It brought the old battlefield back, flames licking through smoke, the radio crackling with unfinished words. The farther he drove, the more he felt the weight of silence pressing in. Wyoming announced itself first with the mountains. They rose out of the plains like the bones of the earth, ridges of granite streaked with snow even in spring. Pines climbed their slopes, dark green against pale sky, and the air carried a clean, sharp chill that sliced through the stale scent of the bus. Samuel slowed, leaning forward on the wheel, his breath catching at the sight. He had imagined wilderness, but he had forgotten how small a man could feel when the world rose around him in jagged walls. Max stood, front paws braced on the dashboard, ears pricked, tail stiff. He gave a low, approving whine, as if claiming the mountains as their rightful ground. The bus coughed again, a sputter that made Samuel curse under his breath. He pulled to the side of the narrow road, grabbed a wrench from the battered toolbox he kept near the driver's seat, and stepped out into the crisp air. The engine was an ancient diesel, its parts rusted but familiar. Samuel had worked with machines in the Army, repairing convoys under fire, piecing together trucks from scavenged parts. Now he bent over the bus's engine with the same patience, fingers steady even as cold wind bit into his skin. Max jumped down and trotted in a circle, sniffing the air, his tail flicking once before he sat watchfully near the front wheel. A car slowed on the road behind them, an old blue pickup that rattled almost as much as the bus. Behind the wheel was a man in his 60s, broad-shouldered despite age, his face tanned and weathered like old leather. His silver hair was cut short, and a thick mustache covered his upper lip. He wore a flannel shirt under a faded denim jacket, sleeves rolled to reveal arms roped with muscle. His eyes, a piercing blue, carried the sharpness of someone who had worked hard all his life and trusted little. He pulled up beside the bus, rolled down the window, and called out in a gravelly voice, "She giving you trouble?" Samuel glanced up, wiped his hands on a rag. "Nothing I can't fix." The man studied him for a moment, gaze lingering on the bus, then on Max. "Not many folks drive a thing like that through these roads. Name's Walter, live down the valley. Bus like that might hold for a while, but you'll want a real mechanic before you get stuck up here." Walter's voice carried no friendliness, but neither did it carry hostility. It was the voice of a man who measured strangers with caution, shaped by years of dealing with wanderers and salesmen who promised more than they delivered. His eyes narrowed slightly, catching something in Samuel's stance, the soldier's way of scanning everything, of standing with weight balanced, of never relaxing. Walter gave a curt nod. "Suit yourself," he muttered, then eased his truck back into motion, tires crunching gravel as he drove off. Samuel watched the pickup disappear into the curve of the road. He returned to the engine, tightened a bolt, and coaxed the bus back to life with a reluctant roar. Max barked once, tail wagging as if satisfied. Samuel climbed back into the seat, his hands steady but his chest tight. Strangers were inevitable, but each one felt like a threat to his fragile solitude. They drove again, climbing higher into the mountain roads. Pines closed in, their shadows deep, and rivers cut through valleys with water that glittered like shards of glass. Samuel felt something loosen in him, a knot unwinding. He spoke quietly to Max. "This is it, boy. This is where we belong. Just you and me." That night, he parked the bus near a clearing at the edge of a forest. The air smelled of resin and cold stone. Samuel built a small fire outside, sitting with his back against the bus's steel side, watching flames dance in the dark. Max lay beside him, head on his paws, eyes reflecting the firelight. Samuel let the silence stretch, not as an enemy this time, but as a weight he might learn to carry. He thought of Denver's noise, of Pete the scrapyard seller laughing at the bus, of Walter's cautious eyes. He thought of how far he had come in 3 days, and how much farther he would need to go to outrun his own mind. When he finally climbed back into the bus, Max following close behind, Samuel stretched out on the cot. Rain began to tap gently on the roof, softer, here than in the city. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in months, sleep came without screaming. It was shallow, fragile, but it was his. The mountains had given him a breath of peace, and though he knew it could not last, he would take it. For a soldier haunted by ghosts, even a moment of calm was a victory. The afternoon sun filtered weakly through the high canopy, broken shafts of light painting shifting patterns across the clearing where Samuel had parked the bus. The air smelled of pine resin and damp earth, a sharp contrast to the exhaust fumes and concrete of Denver. Samuel stepped down from the driver's seat and stretched, the ache in his shoulders reminding him of too many hours on the road. He pulled his jacket tighter against the cool wind, glanced at the sky for signs of weather, and then let his gaze wander over the forest edge. Max had already leapt from the bus, tail high, nose twitching, as he prowled with quiet intent. The German shepherd moved like a creature born to the wild, muscles coiling under his sable and tan coat, his ears flicking at every sound. Samuel watched him with the quiet admiration of a man who understood the worth of vigilance. He trusted Max more than any human being alive. The dog trotted toward a massive oak that leaned like an old soldier, its bark scarred with age. Suddenly, Max began to paw furiously at the soil, sending up sprays of dirt. His body language shifted, tail stiff, hackles raised, not playful digging, but something driven, insistent. Samuel frowned, walked over slowly, boots crunching on fallen branches. "What is it, boy?" he muttered, his voice low and rasping. Max paused only long enough to look back at him with those sharp amber eyes, then returned to digging with renewed urgency. After several minutes, his claws scraped something hard. He barked once, a deep sound that echoed strangely in the clearing. Samuel crouched down, brushing dirt away with his calloused hands. At first it looked like a dull stone, blackened with age. But as he rubbed it with his sleeve, the glint of tarnished silver emerged. He pulled it free, a small pocket watch, its chain broken, its surface scratched but intact. He turned it over in his palm. On the back, faint but still legible, was an engraving, just a single letter, M. The sight of it stirred unease deep in his chest. Samuel sat back on his heels, the object heavy with unspoken weight. His mind flickered to the town he had driven through 2 days earlier, a scatter of weather-beaten houses, gas pumps older than he was, and the narrow main street where he had glimpsed a woman. She had been tall and lean, carrying supplies from the general store, her dark hair tied back severely, her movements brisk, no nonsense. Even from a distance, Samuel had sensed an aura of independence, of someone who had long ago given up expecting help. He remembered hearing her name from a store clerk, Margaret Cole. Now, holding the watch in his hand, the engraved M felt less like coincidence and more like a summons. He hated that thought. Samuel had spent his life since leaving the army trying to avoid entanglements, building walls against curiosity and obligation. He had bought the bus to escape people, not to chase their ghosts. And yet, here he was, staring at an artifact that seemed to demand connection. Max sat beside him, ears perked, chest rising steadily. Samuel ran his thumb across the engraving, then pocketed the watch. He rose, brushed dirt from his knees, and returned to the bus with deliberate calm, though inside his stomach knotted. He brewed a cup of bitter coffee on the stove inside, the familiar ritual steadying his hands. As steam curled from the tin mug, he tried to dismiss the idea. Maybe the M was for someone else. Maybe it was meaningless. But his mind refused to let it rest. That night, sleep eluded him. The silence inside the bus grew oppressive, and each time he drifted near dreams, he heard echoes. The metallic tick of a watch, the voice of a woman calling a name he could not quite make out, the phantom sounds of sand and fire. He rose before dawn, stoked the embers of his small fire outside, and let Max run the perimeter. The dog returned quickly, fur dusted with frost, tail wagging faintly, as if to remind Samuel that the world was still real, still here. As the first pale light touched the mountains, Samuel made a decision. He couldn't ignore the watch. If it truly belonged to Margaret, it carried a story he had stumbled into, whether he wanted it or not. He despised obligation, but something deeper than fear whispered that burying this discovery would be like burying himself alive. 2 days later, he steered the bus back onto the main road and into the town. The place was small, one gas station with peeling paint, a diner with a crooked sign, a handful of houses huddled against the wind. Life here moved slowly, suspiciously, the kind of place where every stranger was noticed and judged. Samuel parked near the diner, killed the engine, and sat for a long time before climbing down. Max jumped after him, stretching, ears twitching. The street was nearly empty except for an old man sweeping the diner's porch. His name, stenciled on the apron he wore, was Harold. He was short and wiry, his frame bent slightly from years of labor, with pale skin creased deeply and a shock of white hair falling across his forehead. His eyes, faded blue, carried a wary kindness, the sort of gaze that had seen too much disappointment, but still offered cautious welcome. Harold paused mid-sweep to watch Samuel, his brow furrowing. "Not many buses roll through here," he said, voice cracked but steady. Samuel nodded, kept his voice short. "Passing through." Harold's eyes shifted to Max, who stood poised, tail still. "Good-looking dog," the old man said, then resumed sweeping. The exchange was brief, but Samuel felt the weight of being seen. He entered the diner to buy coffee, the doorbell jingling overhead. Inside smelled of grease, coffee, and something faintly sweet, like old pie. A waitress moved between tables, her figure tall but slightly stooped, her auburn hair streaked with gray, pulled back into a messy bun. Her name tag read Sarah. Her skin was pale, her hands strong, but reddened from years of dishwater. She greeted Samuel with a tired smile, not unkind but distant, the smile of someone who had given too much of herself to strangers for too many years. "What'll it be?" she asked. "Just coffee," Samuel answered. Sarah poured the dark liquid into a chipped mug, set it before him, and moved on without another word. He sipped in silence, the watch heavy in his pocket. Outside, Max sat visible through the window, a quiet guardian. Samuel wondered if Margaret ever came here, if she walked this same floor, drank this same bitter coffee. He had no proof the watch belonged to her, but instinct told him otherwise. He finished quickly, left money on the counter, and returned to the bus. As he climbed inside, Max gave a low rumble of approval, as though sensing the direction of his master's thoughts. Samuel drove north, toward the valley where Margaret's farm supposedly lay. His chest tightened with each mile. He had wanted solitude, and instead he was driving toward confrontation. The watch in his pocket felt like both a key and a chain, binding him to a story he had not chosen. By dusk, he parked at a ridge overlooking a stretch of farmland. Lights glowed faintly in the distance, a lone house against the fading sky. He sat in the driver's seat long after the engine went cold, staring across the valley, the weight of choice pressing heavy. Max shifted restlessly, nudging his arm. Samuel rubbed the dog's head, his voice low. "I don't know if we're ready, boy, but maybe it's time." He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the silence settle, not as an enemy, but as a judge waiting for his decision. The next morning, the sky over Red Rock was pale, the kind of washed-out blue that made the mountains seem sharper and the wind colder. Samuel guided the bus along the narrow main road, the tires crunching over gravel, the engine grumbling as though protesting every turn. Mac sat in his usual place near the passenger window, ears flicking, nose pressed lightly against the glass. Samuel's hand brushed the pocket where the silver watch rested, its weight pulling at him with every mile. He told himself he only wanted answers, nothing more. The town of Red Rock looked like it had been built decades ago and simply weathered by time. The single row of buildings along Main Street sagged slightly under faded paint and warped wood. A garage stood at the corner, its corrugated roof dented, its sign nearly illegible beneath layers of rust and peeling red paint. Outside, a man in oil-stained coveralls crouched beside an old tractor, his hands black with grease, his shoulders hunched as though carrying decades of work. This was Howard, the man people in the diner had mentioned when Samuel had asked where one might get a machine fixed. Howard was in his late 60s, with thinning gray hair that clung in tufts above his ears, leaving a shiny bald crown exposed to the sun. His face was deeply lined, a map of years spent under the Wyoming sun and bent over machines. His brown eyes were sharp, carrying the intelligence of someone who understood how things worked, whether engines or people. A thick mustache shadowed his upper lip, and he moved with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man who had long ago learned patience. Samuel pulled the bus to the curb and stepped out, Max leaping after him. The mechanic looked up, his gaze sweeping first over the bus, then the man, then the dog. "Well now," Howard said, his voice low and gravelly. "Haven't seen one of those on the road in a long while. What's the story?" Samuel hesitated, uncomfortable under scrutiny, then pulled the watch from his pocket. "I found this," he said simply, holding it out. Howard wiped his hands on a rag tucked into his coveralls, then took the object carefully. He turned it over, eyes narrowing as he traced the engraved letter with a grease-blackened thumb. "I'll be damned," he murmured. "Where'd you come across this?" "Forest outside town," Samuel replied. "My dog found it." Howard studied him, the silence stretching before he handed the watch back. "This belongs to the Coles, Margaret Cole's family. Haven't seen one of these in years. Thought they were lost with her sister." His voice softened almost imperceptibly at the mention of the sister, but his expression quickly shuddered again, practical and unreadable. "Margaret's place is north, up the valley. Hard woman, lives alone, don't take kindly to strangers." Samuel pocketed the watch again, his jaw tightening. "I'm not looking for company." "Doesn't matter what you're looking for," Howard said, reaching for a wrench. "If you've got that watch, you'll need to put it back in the right hands. That's how it works in towns like this." Samuel gave a curt nod, turned back to the bus, and climbed inside. The drive north was rougher, the road narrowing into dirt, winding through rolling hills that bled into the foothills of the mountains. Pines thickened, standing tall and dark, and the air grew sharper, colder. After an hour, the land opened into a valley where a solitary ranch house stood at the edge of fenced fields. The house was simple, 2 stories of weathered wood, the porch sagging slightly, shutters faded by sun and snow. Smoke curled faintly from a stovepipe, and beyond the house a barn leaned against the wind. Samuel parked the bus at the edge of the road, shut off the engine, and sat for a long moment. His pulse was steady but heavy, his mind rehearsing words he didn't believe in. Max shifted beside him, tail thumping once against the seat, urging him forward. When he stepped down from the bus, The crunch of gravel under his boots carried across the open space. From the porch, a woman emerged. Margaret Cole was in her mid-40s, tall and lean, her frame wiry from years of farm work. She wore a faded plaid shirt tucked into worn jeans, the knees stained from labor, and scuffed brown boots. Her dark brown hair was pulled back into a severe ponytail, streaked with gray at the temples. Her skin was sun-browned, weathered, marked by fine lines around her eyes and mouth. Her gaze, a sharp hazel, carried suspicion and something harder, resilience shaped by solitude. She walked with a purposeful stride, each step deliberate, like someone accustomed to confronting problems head-on. "You lost?" she called, her voice carrying easily across the yard, clipped and direct. Samuel shook his head, holding up the watch. "Found this. Thought it might belong to you." She descended the steps quickly, boots striking wood with finality. Up close, her face was even harsher, her jaw tight, cheekbones sharp beneath taut skin. She stopped at the fence that marked the edge of her property, eyes locked on the object in his hand. "Where did you get that?" she demanded, her tone suddenly sharp. Samuel held her gaze. "My dog dug it up near the forest." Margaret's hands clenched against the top of the fence rail. She extended one hand, palm steady, despite the tremor in her breath. Samuel placed the watch carefully into her grasp. For a long moment she simply stared at it, her thumb tracing the worn engraving. Her eyes flicked up to his, filled not with gratitude, but with something rawer, pain. "This was my sister's," she whispered, her voice almost breaking. "She wore it the day she disappeared." Samuel felt the weight of her words settle between them. He said nothing. He knew too well what it meant to lose someone and be left with only fragments. Margaret's expression hardened again. The flicker of vulnerability shuddered away. She looked at him sharply, as though testing for deceit. "Why bring it here? What do you want from me?" "Nothing," Samuel said flatly. "Just thought it should go back where it belongs." He stepped back from the fence, Max moving in sync with him, ears alert but calm. Margaret's knuckles whitened as she gripped the watch. For a heartbeat, silence hung heavy, only the wind whistling through the grass. Then she turned abruptly, retreating toward the house, the screen door slamming behind her. Samuel stood for another moment, the knot in his chest tightening. He had given back the relic, but he knew it had not ended there. The look in Margaret's eyes had carved itself into him, a mixture of suspicion, grief, and a question she hadn't dared to voice. He turned, walked back to the bus, and climbed inside. Max hopped in after him, curling onto the seat with a low sigh. Samuel sat motionless, staring at the weathered house in the valley. The watch was gone from his pocket, but its weight remained in his mind, heavier than before. The first storm of winter came without warning, rolling down from the mountains like an invading army. By late afternoon, snow whipped across the valley in violent gusts, the wind howling through the pines, tearing at the bus where Samuel and Max huddled inside. The school bus creaked against the cold, its thin metal skin trembling under the assault. Samuel sat near the small diesel heater he had rigged against the wall, the blue flames sputtering weakly. He pulled his jacket tighter, watching frost form along the edges of the windows. Max lay curled on the cot, his breath visible in the frigid air, ears flicking each time the wind slammed into the bus. Samuel's hands trembled, not just from the cold, but from memory. He had known nights like this before. In deserts where the temperature plummeted after dusk, where men wrapped themselves in thin blankets and prayed the fire held. He hated the helplessness, the sense of being trapped by something as simple as weather. He leaned down, adjusted the fuel line, coaxed the heater to life, but the flame guttered once, twice, and then died completely, leaving only the hiss of wind through the cracks in the bus walls. A curse slipped between his teeth. The diesel line was frozen, and he had neither tools nor supplies to thaw it. Max whined softly, shifting closer, his body pressed against Samuel's leg. "I know, boy," Samuel whispered, rubbing the dog's fur with a hand stiff from cold. "We'll get through it." But the night dragged on, the temperature falling, each breath sharp as glass in his chest. Sleep came in shivering bursts, broken by jolts of fear that he and Max might not wake at all. When dawn finally came, pale and merciless, Samuel forced himself up and pried the door open. Snow had piled against the bus, a white drift that crumbled under his boots. He stepped into the bitter air, his body aching, and froze. On the ground just outside the bus was a neat stack of split firewood, bundled with rope, and beside it a red plastic can half full of diesel fuel. His breath fogged as he stared at it. There were no footprints visible. The night's snowfall had covered them, but he didn't need proof. He knew only one person who could have done this: Margaret Cole. For a moment he felt anger rise, anger at being seen as weak, at needing help, but beneath it something else burned, quieter, deeper: gratitude. He carried the supplies inside, set them down carefully, and fed the heater. When the blue flame caught and roared steady, warmth spread slowly through the bus. Max stretched luxuriously, his tail thumping against the cot. Samuel sat watching the fire, his mind unsettled. Margaret had crossed her invisible boundary to keep him alive. That meant she had been watching, had chosen not to let him freeze. It unsettled him more than the storm itself. Days passed before Samuel found a chance to answer her unspoken gesture. The snow thawed slightly, revealing the brown scars of frozen earth. On the third day, while driving past her ranch, Samuel noticed her bent near the old water pump beside the barn. She was fighting the handle with both hands, her body taut with effort, but the pump refused to yield. He pulled the bus to the roadside, hesitated, then stepped down. Max bounded ahead, trotting in circles before sitting near the fence, head cocked curiously. Margaret looked up sharply, her hazel eyes narrowing. She wore a thick wool coat patched at the elbows, her dark hair loose for once, whipping around her face in the cold wind. Even disheveled, she radiated the same unyielding independence, though her breath came heavy from exertion. "Pump's frozen," she said curtly, as if daring him to offer pity. Samuel didn't. "Tools?" She hesitated, then pointed toward a battered wooden crate near the barn. He retrieved it, knelt by the pump, and began working without another word. His hands moved with the mechanical precision of a soldier who had repaired engines under fire, unscrewing bolts, checking seals, scraping away ice crust. Margaret stood nearby, arms crossed, her expression unreadable, but she did not leave. After an hour, Samuel managed to free the valve, flush the line, and coax the pump back to life. Water gushed clear and cold into the trough, steam rising in the winter air. Max barked once, delighted, and darted forward to lap at the stream. Margaret's gaze softened for just a moment before she masked it again. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice quieter than before. Samuel only nodded, wiped his hands on a rag, and replaced the tools. He turned to leave, but Margaret spoke again. "The wood and fuel," she said, her eyes steady. "It wasn't charity, just common sense. Neighbors don't let each other freeze." Samuel studied her face, the strong jawline, the faint lines at the corners of her mouth. She was telling the truth, but he knew it had cost her something to admit it. He inclined his head. "Then fixing the pump is the same, just common sense." For the first time her mouth curved slightly. Not a smile, not yet, but something close. She turned back to the barn, dismissing him with a gesture that carried less hostility than before. Samuel returned to the bus, Max bounding happily at his side. That night, as he sat inside with the stove radiating warmth, Samuel thought of the exchange. No words of friendship, no promises, but a bond had been forged nonetheless, silent and fragile. They were both survivors, living on the edge of solitude, wary of trust. Yet in the silence of winter, two small acts had spoken louder than any conversation. In the stillness, Samuel felt something stir that he had not allowed himself in years, the faintest spark of belonging. The night was still when it began, the kind of stillness that felt stretched too thin, like glass waiting to crack. Samuel lay half awake on the cot in the bus, one arm draped across his chest, his breathing shallow. The stove burned low, embers faintly glowing in the small firebox, filling the bus with a fragile warmth. Outside, snow crunched occasionally as it settled, and the moon hung cold and distant above the valley. Max shifted suddenly, his ears pricking. Then came the growl, low, steady, a warning pulled from deep in the dog's chest. Samuel was up in an instant, heart hammering. "What is it, boy?" Max darted to the door, nose pressed against the thin steel, then barked once, sharp, urgent. Samuel grabbed the rifle he kept by the cot, slid a magazine into place, and opened the bus door. The wind hit him like a blade, carrying the scent of pine and frost. Max bounded into the snow, paws kicking up powder, barking toward the north. Samuel followed his line of sight, and his stomach tightened. Across the valley, near Margaret Cole's ranch, movement flickered, shadows against shadows. He recognized the pattern instantly, a predator circling livestock. He had seen it in deserts with jackals, in jungles with feral dogs, and now here in Wyoming with wolves. He started the bus engine, coaxing it to life with a reluctant roar, and drove quickly up the road. The bus groaned, tires slipping on icy patches, but Samuel pressed it hard until the faint outline of Margaret's barn appeared. He cut the engine, jumped down, rifle slung across his chest, Max already sprinting ahead. Snow crunched under his boots as he ran toward the fence line. The sound of bleating reached him, high, frantic, terrified. The sheep clustered at the far end of the pen, white shapes pressed tight, their fear a living force. A single wolf stood outside the fence, massive, its gray coat blending into the night, yellow eyes burning with hunger. It moved with the patient confidence of a predator that had stalked before, pacing back and forth, searching for weakness in the rails. Samuel raised his rifle, sighted the wolf, finger brushing the trigger. But something inside him hesitated. He had killed too much in his life. Men, threats, enemies real and imagined. Each shot had left ghosts that never departed. He couldn't bear to add another tonight, not when there was another way. He dropped the rifle barrel, grabbed a sheet of corrugated metal lying near the fence, and slammed it with the butt of the gun. The sound exploded into the night, harsh, metallic, unnatural. The wolf startled, ears flattening, body lowering. Samuel struck again, the clang echoing across the valley like a cannon. Max barked furiously, lunging forward but keeping behind the fence line as trained. The wolf snarled once, then retreated into the tree line, its form melting into the darkness. Silence returned, broken only by the ragged breaths of the sheep and the fading echo of metal from the porch of the house. Margaret appeared, lantern in hand. Her coat was hastily thrown on over a nightshirt, her hair unbound and wild around her shoulders. The lantern light caught her face, sharp with suspicion at first, then shifting to something else as her eyes took in the scene. Samuel standing at the fence, rifle lowered, Max beside him like a sentry, the sheep unharmed. She approached slowly, boots crunching in the snow, the lantern swaying. "You didn't shoot," she said flatly. Her voice carried more surprise than question. Samuel wiped a hand across his mouth, his breath steaming. "Didn't need to." Margaret studied him, her hazel eyes narrowing, then softening slightly. "Most men around here would have dropped it without thinking." "Most men aren't me," Samuel answered quietly. The silence stretched between them, filled with the distant whisper of wind through the trees. For the first time since their paths had crossed, Margaret's gaze held no suspicion, no hostility, only a flicker of respect. She inclined her head slightly, almost like a soldier acknowledging another. "You saved them," she said simply. And her tone carried weight, an admission hard won. Max sat at Samuel's side, tail sweeping the snow, his breath coming in sharp white puffs. Margaret's eyes fell briefly on the dog, and something like recognition passed over her features. Recognition of loyalty, of a bond forged in hardship. She stepped back toward the house, her lantern casting long shadows. Before she disappeared inside, she looked once more over her shoulder. "Good night, Samuel." The words were plain, but to him they carried the weight of a truce. He stood in the snow long after she vanished, the rifle hanging loose in his hands. Max leaned against his leg, warm and steady, as though reminding him that not all battles needed bullets. When Samuel finally returned to the bus, he lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint crackle of the stove. He knew the fight wasn't just with wolves or with the cold, it was with himself, with the part of him that had always chosen violence first. Tonight he had chosen differently, and Margaret had seen it. For the first time since he arrived in Wyoming, Samuel felt the invisible wall between them shift, not fallen, but cracked enough for light to pass through. Winter loosened its grip on the valley slowly, as though reluctant to release its claim. Snow melted into rivulets that carved paths down the slopes, filling the creeks until they sang again beneath the budding pines. The air was still sharp, but the sun carried warmth now, striking the mountains with brighter fire and softening the earth beneath Samuel's boots. For the first time in months he opened the windows of the bus without fearing the cold, and the interior smelled of fresh pine instead of smoke and metal. Samuel had spent the weeks since the night of the wolf working tirelessly. The school bus, once nothing but rust and dents, had begun to transform under his hands. He salvaged old planks from a collapsed shed near the ridge, sanding them smooth and fitting them over the cracked windows, framing them with care. A small cast-iron stove he had traded for in town sat snugly bolted to the floor, its chimney rising neatly through the roof. The bench he built for Max stretched along one wall, covered with a folded green army blanket. The dog had claimed it instantly, curling into its corner like a king on his throne, his amber eyes glowing contentment. Samuel moved with the precision of a soldier and the patience of a craftsman. Each nail driven, each cut of wood was more than work. It was ritual, a way to stitch order into the chaos of his own mind. When he finished, he stood back and looked at the bus, hardly believing what it had become. It was no longer just a machine to carry him away. It was shelter. It was home. Margaret appeared more often now, though never announced. Sometimes Samuel would find a basket of eggs left near the fence, or a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, the faint scent of yeast rising from it. Other times she would stand at a distance, watching as he worked, her posture rigid but her eyes softer than before. Samuel did not call her over, nor did she approach. Their conversations were gestures, not words. But one morning in early spring he decided to bridge the distance. He brewed coffee over the stove, the rich scent curling into the air, and when he saw her near the fence line, he called out across the field. "Coffee's ready, if you'd like." Margaret paused, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She was dressed in a simple flannel shirt and worn jeans, her hair braided this time, the braid long and dark against her back streaked with gray. Her face remained cautious, but there was curiosity too, and something like weariness at always standing apart. She hesitated, then walked slowly across the yard, boots sinking slightly into thawed earth. Max wagged his tail, ears perked, then settled back onto his bench as though sensing this was no moment for barking. Margaret climbed the steps of the bus, ducking under the doorway, and stood in the narrow aisle. Her eyes swept over the interior, the stove, the wooden frames, the bench, the orderliness of everything. Her hazel gaze lingered on the bench, where Max rested, then on the small table Samuel had built from scavenged planks, a pair of tin mugs waiting. "You've done a lot with it," she said finally, her voice softer than usual. "Didn't think an old bus could look livable." Samuel poured coffee into both mugs, handed one to her. His hands were steady, though inside he felt a strange tension, as if he were handing over more than a drink. She accepted it, wrapped her fingers around the metal, and sat stiffly at the table. They drank in silence, but it was not the brittle silence of strangers. It was steady, cautious, almost companionable. Samuel studied her from the corner of his eye. The straight line of her shoulders, the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the strength in her hands. She carried herself like someone who had borne loss and refused to bend. But he saw, just for a moment, the exhaustion beneath. Margaret looked around again. "This bus, it's different than a house. It can move, always ready to leave." Samuel nodded. "That's the point. I thought walls would protect me. Turns out wheels might." Her lips twitched at the ghost of a smile. "And yet you've stayed here." "Maybe," Samuel admitted, his voice low. "Some things are worth staying for." He didn't look directly at her when he said it, but Max did, his tail thumping once as if in agreement. Margaret didn't reply, but her silence felt less like distance now and more like consideration. They finished the coffee. She rose, set the mug carefully on the table, and stepped toward the door. Before leaving, she paused, hand resting briefly on the frame. "It suits you," she said, her voice almost kind. Then she was gone, the screen door snapping shut behind her. Samuel stood in the bus long after, the warmth of her words lingering heavier than the stove's fire. That night, he sat on the steps of the bus with Max pressed against his leg, watching the stars wheel overhead. For years he had built walls, concrete in his mind, steel in his life. But this bus, this improbable, patched-together machine, was teaching him something he had forgotten. That freedom wasn't about locking the world out. It was about letting a little of it in. He looked at Max, who gazed back with calm amber eyes, and then across the valley toward the faint light in Margaret's window. For the first time, Samuel didn't feel like a man hiding in a fortress. He felt like a man at home. Samuel's journey reminds us that sometimes God's greatest miracles are not thunder in the skies, but quiet moments of healing. A warm fire on a freezing night, a loyal dog at our side, or a neighbor who extends a hand when we least expect it. These small mercies are the threads of grace that hold us together in everyday life. And maybe, just maybe, God places people and moments in our path, not to test us, but to remind us we are never truly alone. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of resilience and grace. May the Lord bless and keep you, and may His quiet miracles find their way into your life too.